Okay. So let us start. So I was just saying yesterday, just recapping very briefly on one of the main points, which I'm going to elaborate on today, and that is this idea that the main purpose probably of dependent origination is to show the linkage, show why there is suffering. In other words, the linkage between suffering and ignorance, avidya at the beginning. So as long as there is avidya, there will be suffering as a consequence. So this is the main thing. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take each of the terms in dependent origination, starting from the beginning. I'm going to explain each of the terms, what they actually mean, and then show how they link up to the term which comes afterwards, right? The whole point here is that this is a chain of causality. I was talking yesterday about sufficient causes and necessary causes. So this is a chain of causality. So the point here is to understand how each factor leads on to the next one. What is actually the connection between these factors? Starting off with avidya itself. So this term in Pali, which is avidya, usually translated as ignorance, and it's okay. It is not a terribly bad translation, I think, but it's often useful to understand these terms from different angles. Yes, ignorance is one way of understanding it. Once you see a Pali term, you see it translated in different ways, you get a broader understanding of what it is about. So another way of understanding this word avidya is to understand, instead of the positive side is vidya, the positive side vidya, literally means understanding things correctly, right? Seeing the world in the right way. So because vidya means seeing the world in the right way, understanding things, avidya means like not really seeing the world correctly. So it means like being deluded, right? Having a distorted understanding of things. The world is one way, but you think of the world in a different way. That's called delusion. So delusion is a very useful way of looking at this word avidya. It's a distortion in our mental, in our cognitive faculties, if you like, in our way of looking at things. And interesting, the word vidya actually, it is, we're here talking about the Pali language, which is of course an Indo-European language. All European languages too are related to Pali in one way. And the English word wit is actually related to the word vidya. They actually come from the same source. So in English you say wit, usually it means like funny, right? You're witty. Vidya does nothing to do with being funny, but you're also talking about somebody having ready wit, right? Being like sharp, having sharp faculties and being clever. And this is related to the idea of understanding in Pali. So they can see the direct relationship between the words there. It's always a bit fascinating to look at these relationships, I find. So what is this avidya at the source of the dependent origination? What does that actually mean? What does it refer to? And the way it is always defined within dependent origination is actually part of some of the sutras that I suggested for reading material here. The way it is always defined is defined as dukkha jnana, the knowledge of suffering, samudaya jnana, the knowledge of the arising of suffering, the knowledge of the cessation of suffering, and the knowledge of the path. So basically it means the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, right? Or the lack of understanding is then avidya, delusion. So not understanding the Four Noble Truths, it's basically what it means. So first of all, what does it mean to understand the Four Noble Truths? What does actually that imply? Sometimes you think about suffering. What does it mean to understand suffering? And of course, one thing is just to understand, be realistic about life, right? Seeing life in its positive sides and also its negative sides, understanding life fully in a kind of ordinary experience. That is part of understanding suffering, just to be realistic about things. But when the Buddha is talking about understanding the Four Noble Truths, what he really means is this idea of insight, of seeing things with a mind which is very peaceful and having a deep perception of what actually is going on. That is what it really means. So it's not, if you think you're going to understand suffering, it's not kind of enough to add up all the sufferings in life, right? This morning I didn't get exactly the breakfast I wanted, right? And one tiny little suffering. And adding up all those sufferings is not going to be enough to allow you to understand what it is all about. Really, the only way to understand suffering is to have an insight and to see it. Only then can you understand it fully. So all of this, what we're doing here now today, is going to be approximating it. It's going to be giving us some intellectual ideas what this means, and some of that will sink in. But the full understanding only happens through insight itself. That's important, right? Because it means that this is a very profound truth. Even though you can understand suffering to some extent, actually suffering is something very, very profound to fully grasp what it means. Sometimes people ask, what is the right translation for dukkha? Dukkha is the Pali word for often translated as suffering. Some people say we should translate it as unsatisfactoriness instead, right? And I think there is some basis for that, because some of the sufferings are very subtle, some of the dukkhas are very subtle, they're not that profound. So there's some truth to that. But I think I prefer translating it as suffering, because it gives the idea that we don't really understand it properly, right? If you say it means unsatisfactoriness, well, we can all understand that life to some extent is unsatisfactory. But to understand that life is suffering, it shows us that there is a profundity to this idea of dukkha, which we're not usually aware of in our ordinary lives. So it points us to that, and for that reason I think translating as suffering is probably more useful, because it guides us in the right direction, that there's something to be uncovered here, something to be understood. So what are these Four Noble Truths then? What is it that we don't understand? And the first noble truth of suffering, the way it is described usually in the sutras, is that birth is suffering, old age is suffering. Not aging, by the way. Old age is the proper translation, not aging. Usually you see aging in the translations, but actually means old age. And then death is suffering. Sometimes illness is also included in there. So this is the beginning, right? So you may think, yeah, I know all that, right? Of course, old age and death is suffering. But this is the problem. It's kind of which everybody thinks, I understand this already. It's precisely the problem. Because it usually is only a very superficial understanding that we have of these things. So even basic things, right? The basic realities of life, we haven't really taken them on board properly. This is a very simple part, but it's part of this thing we call avijja, of delusion. Even the basic things of life, we haven't really taken them properly on board. So let's have a look at these three things very briefly. Birth is suffering. This is probably the least important of these three. But what does it mean that birth is suffering? Well, it probably means that coming into this world is not very nice, right? It probably means that you are kind of sitting there in your mother's tummy, quite happy and content, right, nice and warm, and you're getting everything is very simple, and you get born into this cold world, right? Suddenly everything is a bit out of control compared to what it was. So it probably means that physical birth itself is suffering. But of course it also means that you are now you're starting a life, and we all know what life entails. So all of those entail things that, birth entail. In other words, all the sufferings of life, all the problems of life, that also comes with birth itself. Because now you know, or something inside of you tells you that I'm going to have to undergo all these things. And there was a newspaper article, I remember, this is kind of, again, Ajahn Brahm found this newspaper article somewhere. I don't know where he gets these things from, but he gets these things from wherever, probably some of his disciples sending it from somewhere. And this was a newspaper cutting from somewhere, a newspaper in the United States, some kind of obscure newspaper, some local paper in somewhere. And there was this short little story about this baby that had been born in a hospital, right? And the story was that as soon as this baby was born, coming out, it was a tiny little baby, right? As soon as it was born, the first thing, it opened its mouth and it said, "Oh no, not again." Right? That's what you see, birth is suffering, right? If you're clear about what's going on, oh no. So I don't know if it happened. It is conceivable, I think it's conceivable, at least it can actually happen. But maybe it's just one of those dodgy stories. But anyway, it's interesting. There's some truth to that, and that's why people laugh, right? You see that there is something to that. So this is another reason. And then, but also I think one of the reasons why birth is suffering as well, if you know how I'm sure you have probably some knowledge about these things called near-death experience and this kind of things. And when people have an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience, often they go together. What they often find is that they often find, wow, it is so nice, right? I'm getting out of this body. Wow, I feel so light, I feel so good. And you see the burden of this body. And sometimes you hear people, they have this out-of-body experience, and then they have to go back into the body again. No, I don't want to go back into the body, please. That often people will be sick, right? That's when they have these kind of things. They've been in an accident or something like that. The body is completely mangled and completely distorted. Don't want to go back into that body again. And so the body is basically, you see that the body is actually suffering from the point of view of somebody who has escaped from that body. And now birth means you have to go back into the body again, right? So you can see yourself drawn into this physical existence. And that knowledge that no, you have to go back into that again, that I think also is an aspect of birth, is suffering. Anyway, there's just some thoughts for you. It's hard to know exactly what is going on there, but these are some of the possibilities anyway. And I don't think this is the most important part of the idea of dukkha. When we come to old age, jara, and marana, death, these are more important aspects of dukkha. And jara, old age, right? I'm sure you all know that is suffering, right? To some extent anyway, but it's good to reflect on that as well. Old age really is suffering. You look at people who are really older, they are getting close to death, right? They can't do anything for themselves anymore. Everything has to be looked after for them. They have to be washed and cleaned and clothed and fed and all these kind of things. And it's not much fun. There comes a point when you rather just turn off the whole thing and just get out of here, right? This is why some people, they prefer euthanasia. When they come to late in life, they had enough. There's no point in going on anymore. And this is when you start to understand that old age actually really is problematic. And then the last one, of course, is death itself. And this is I think, a very useful reflection to think about death, to remind yourself that this is where we're all heading, right? And sometimes we're going there much faster than we think we are. Most people usually tend to think that death is some way off. Sometimes it isn't some way off. Sometimes it's just around the corner. We just don't know. So the reflection of death, and this is, again, as I was saying yesterday, how do we know that a particular teaching is important in the suttas? And one way to know is how often does the Buddha talk about these things? And death contemplation, reminding ourselves that we're going to die, is one of those things you see quite often in the suttas. And the Buddha specifically says that this is a reflection that everyone should do. It's not the reflection that is specific for monastics, right? It is for lay people, for monastics, it is for men, it is for women, it's for everybody. Everybody should do this kind of reflection because it actually is very powerful. So reminding ourselves of this, making it real, right? I am going to die. It's not just some kind of fantasy. It's not just everybody else who's going to die. And this may seem silly, but when you read the paper, right, you read of somebody who's died, it's always somebody else. It doesn't really touch you properly. It's very hard for you to put yourself in the place of that other person. So the closer the person is to you, the more real it becomes. So if you have a friend who dies, it becomes, oh, okay, it's getting more real, right? If you have a family member who dies, a very close family member, it starts to become very real. And then if you get sick yourself, seriously ill, so that you are, on the verge of dying perhaps, then it starts to become really, really real. But the point here is not to have to go through all that trouble, but to make it real, without all those, problematic situations that you have to go through. So this is, and it's a very powerful reflection, because if you remember death, if you make this real, if you know that it can happen at any time, if you're not ready now, how are you going to be ready when it actually will happen? You won't be ready, right? Now is the only time to be ready. If you're ready now, you will be ready when it happens. If you're not ready now, chances are you will not be ready when it actually happens. So by doing this, what it means is that we're starting to get another perspective on life itself. We realize that all the things in this world that we are which are dear to us and which are important to us, we cannot hold on to these things, right? And it leads to a slight detaching from the things of this world. It gives us a bit more distance. It gives us a bit more kind of, especially it gives us a more even mind state. If you attach less to things, if you're less involved with the things in this world, it means you don't have so much desire anymore. When you don't have so much desire for the things in this world, you have less aversion towards the things around you. And it makes your mind much more even, much more balanced. And I can actually go through life in a much more mindful, a much more balanced way, rather than being pulled around by the world all the time. So it's a very powerful reflection, and I would recommend all of you to try to do that, at least a little bit, right? If you feel it's scary, some people don't like it, think it's scary. Actually, it's not all that scary once you get used to it, but if you feel it's scary, of course, be careful. But if it comes fairly naturally to you, try to bring it as close as you possibly can, right? Imagine yourself, okay, I'm going to die. What does it feel like to die? Sometimes you can do like a death contemplation during meditation practice, right? This is the end of your life. What does it feel like? And if you do it in the right way, you start to detach. You start to feel that the world kind of starts to fade away. The world doesn't matter so much anymore. And you start to see the big picture of life instead. Of course, all of this becomes much more powerful when you kind of incorporate it with the idea of rebirth, right? That's when it becomes even more powerful. And you start to see the world in a very different way. Instead of looking at this narrow view of the world, this life here and now, you start to see the world as something much bigger, right? You start to see, wow, there's all this, actually, what I'm seeing is this tiny little thing, right? But reality actually is so much more. And once you get if you can accept that, if that is something that kind of comes to you fairly easily, it means you change your investment strategy, right? Because our investment strategy is always about this life, right? Or it tends to be about this life. Okay, we invest so that this life becomes good, great, we're happy in this life. But once you look at the big picture and start to understand that what you do now affects not just this life, it affects actually all of this enormous thing we call existence, life after life after life. The way you invest your time and the way you invest your resources changes. And you start to look at, well, how can I maximize, not only be happy in this little life, but how can I ensure that my happiness will continue also after I die, after I pass away? Instead of investing everything into your career, right, into your partnerships, into your whatever it is in this life, you start to invest more broadly. And of course, that investment is the investment in the mind itself. How do it's about purifying your mind, making your mind happy, making your mind a good place to be feeling well inside of yourself, right? That is that real investment which pays off in this life and also in the future. So it is kind of it is one of those things which you cannot go wrong if you invest in your own mind in the right way. And there's a very nice simile. There's some of the similes of the Buddha I find them so powerful, and the similes that I find powerful, maybe you don't, but there's a lot of similes in there, and some of those similes are bound to speak to you. And one of these similes is in a sutta called the Paṭiccasamuppāda Sutta, right? One of the discourses of the Buddha found in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 54. And in the sutta he talks about sense objects or sense pleasures in the world, and he talks about how should we look upon this. And this is one of those similes that have to do with death and all of these things kind of combined into one. And what he says is that the sense objects, the sensory objects of the world, right, whatever it is, whether it is relationships or whether it is all of the things that we own in the world or whatever it is, they are like borrowed goods. Right? It's like, he says, it's like a man or a woman, somebody who has borrowed all these goods, like borrowed in those days, of course. Luxury goods were very simple compared to what they are now, but they had a fancy carriage, right? Some fancy jewelry, some nice clothes, Benares cloth. The Benares cloth was considered the best cloth in those days, just as it is today. If you go to India today, you go to Benares, they want to sell you the fancy Benares cloth. Nothing has changed in India for 2,500 years. That's the feeling you get sometimes in India. Nothing has changed here. It's all kind of stood still, right? Which is very fascinating about India. It's come to something very remarkable about that country. But anyway, so you have all these nice things, right? The Benares cloth or whatever, but it's all borrowed, right? And then you go into the city and people say, wow, look at this is how the rich people, how they enjoy themselves, right? With all these beautiful belongings or whatever. And then the owners come and say, okay, thank you very much, we'll take back our belongings. Right? And then you feel, oh, okay, you feel kind of naked, right? Everybody's kind of been praising you as this wealthy person who's doing, or maybe not praising, but envying you or whatever it is. And then suddenly you don't have it anymore. So if you have attached to that wealth, if you have attached to those things, if you desire those things, you will suffer, of course, much more as a consequence. And the Buddha says, this is life, right? Everything in life is just that. It's all borrowed goods. Everything we have is borrowed. All our possessions, all our relationships are borrowed goods. Our physical body is borrowed goods, right? You're going to have to give this physical body up. It's borrowed goods. Not only that, but also the large aspects of who we take ourselves to be, our ego, our sense of self is also borrowed goods. What is our sense of self? It has to do with the relationships that we have to things in this world, right? So if you have a certain education, if you have a certain job, if you have a certain social status, if you have a certain amount of wealth, if you are a son or a daughter, or if you are a parent or a grandparent, whatever it is, all of these relationships that we have in the world define us as people. And all of that disappears when you die. There's also borrowed goods, right? So much of our life, so much of our existence is borrowed goods. Many of these things, they will disappear during life itself. You see all these bushfires. We recently had a big bushfire, actually very close to our monastery. It was only about 70 kilometers or so, no, 60 kilometers from our monastery in Perth. And about almost 100 houses were just kind of burnt down, right? It happened incredibly fast. They said it took only 7 minutes or something for this 100 houses to burn down. So this is what happens. Things just get destroyed during life. A burglar comes to your house, takes some of your prized possessions, right? Whatever it is. And if it doesn't happen during this life, it happens when you die. Everything will have to go when you pass away. So it's all borrowed stuff. And of course then you think to yourself, well, how do we normally treat borrowed goods? Let's say that you are renting an apartment somewhere. This is kind of the usual example that I like to use. If you're renting an apartment from somebody, an apartment isn't in a very good shape, it needs some, refurbishing and kind of fitting out or whatever. And if you are renting a place for only a few months, how much of your own money, how much of your own effort, how much of yourself are you going to put into that apartment? There's a limit, right? You're only going to have it for 6 months. The person who benefits from all your effort and money is the landowner, not you. Okay, you benefit a little bit, but it's only for a very short period of time. And the shorter that rental period is, if it's only for a week, you're probably not going to bother doing anything almost. If it's for a few months, you'll do a little bit more. But the point is, it is all rented. It's short term. You're not going to put an enormous amount of effort into that thing that you're renting. And it's exactly the same thing about this life, right? When you remember death, and when you have the idea of rebirth, you understand your investment should be different. You should invest your time, invest your resources, invest everything in a different way. And the mind is really what comes into focus. In any case, even if it were only for this life, in the end, it is the mind that is the most powerful thing in this life as well. If you want to be happy, the mind is the place to invest, really. Doesn't mean that you don't do anything else, that you quit your job and you kind of get out of your relationship and you become a monastic or whatever straight away. It doesn't mean that, but it just means that your attitude to things start to change. Instead of pursuing material things for material things' sake, instead of pursuing status for status' sake, you start to, you still do those things. You still have to have a job, you still have to survive, but you do it with a different attitude. It's the how we do things in the world that matters, not the what we do. How is far more important than the what. So we start to look at those things differently. Your job, instead of looking at it as just as a means of livelihood, you start to look at it as, well, how can I use my job to be kind, to be compassionate? You start to think, okay, if I do my job well, then the customers might be happy, my co-workers will, we will have a good kind of atmosphere in the company, everybody kind of supporting each other, and you're acting out of kindness, you're acting for a different purpose, you do things in a different way, your attitude changes, and that is what this really is about. It doesn't mean you have to make any drastic changes externally, but the way you look at things become different. So this is what death contemplation is all about, right? It's about understanding the big picture, understanding what is important in life. And this is one small way that avijja is decreasing. The more clarity you have about these things, the less avijja you really have, the less delusion you have about life. Okay, birth, old age, death, right? The next part of the sutta is being separated from what is dear to you, right? And being united with what is not dear to you, right? So this happens all the time, right? Being united with things that are not dear to us means like hearing things you don't want to hear, right? People say something to you which is not nice. Happens all the time. We hear things we don't want to hear every day, basically. Or having some physical pains in the body, right? Being in the presence of something which is not nice. Dear things, dear people, the things disappearing, your family members getting ill, whatever it is. These are issues that come up all the time. And what it really boils down to is that you cannot actually control the world. That's what it really boils down to. It means that our feelings, our experience of the world is out of control. That's really what it means. In the end, it comes back to us, looking at how you experience things. The feelings inside of you are out of control. And this is interesting because we tend to actually feel the exact opposite. We tend to think that life is under control to some extent, but the reality is actually the exact opposite. Things tend to be out of control. And this is just to remind you that these things are out of control. We cannot control most of the things in life. You can control what you have for breakfast, you can control small things, but a lot of things can never actually be controlled. So this is an important reminder. I'll talk a bit more about this afterwards, because the idea of control and out of control is one of the fundamental aspects of this idea of avijja. Yes. Okay, and then we have the next aspect here of suffering is not getting what you want is suffering, right? Again, I think this is a fairly obvious one. Life is full of desires, full of cravings, and very often we don't get those things that we want. But one of the points here is that the very aspect of craving itself is an aspect of suffering. Not getting what you want is suffering. So when you crave, right, when you have that desire there, already you don't have the goal of the object. Already you are some distance away from the things you want. That is interesting. It is actually an important point, because it means that a lot of the time there is a subtle kind of suffering underlying existence pretty much all the time. Because it's very rare that we are completely devoid of any kind of desire, any kind of craving. It's always there kind of slightly just under the surface, right? And there's always a sense of dissatisfaction there, not being fully satisfied. And it is this dissatisfaction, not being fully satisfied, not feeling fully complete in a sense, as if there is a hole inside of us, an itch that always needs to be scratched, is what keeps us going, right? Running around, being restless, being agitated. This is what craving is. And it's very rare, and you can see this in your meditation practice, right? You sit down, you may feel relatively at ease, relatively good about yourself, and yet the mind doesn't really stop, it doesn't become peaceful, the mind runs on. And that is driven by desire, driven by craving. And one of the things that you start to see that as you progress on the path is that you start to move towards more, I was talking about this yesterday as well, you start to move towards greater sense of satisfaction, right? And this is one of those things you start to understand, that as you practice this path, as the craving dies down, as you get your happiness from inner states of mind rather than from external things, you're turning inward rather than turning outward, you start to understand that this craving business, this whole thing, running after things, that is the problem in the first place. And when you get into a very deep state of meditation, for the first time in your life, you feel complete. You feel satisfied. You feel that there is no itch anymore that needs to be scratched. You feel that the hole inside of you, which you're always running around in the world trying to fill up inside of you, it's gone. Right? And this is the power of this whole path, and you feel complete as a human being for the first time. So in a sense, you can argue that in a sense you have discovered there already the meaning of life itself, because you have actually found the thing that everybody is really yearning for, the fulfillment, the sense of completion inside of you. So notice this, so you can see again, this is avidya, right? This ignorance. The Buddha has to tell us not getting what you want is suffering. Usually we run around in the world trying to get things, trying to fill up the hole inside by running after things in the world. The hole inside never gets filled up that way. The hole inside gets filled up by turning the attention in a different direction, by practicing a spiritual path that gives rise to a kind of autonomous, independent happiness inside. And then when you sit down and you find the happiness from inside through meditation practice, that is actually where you find that thing filled up, and you find yourself complete for the first time. It's strange. You have to turn your attention in a completely different direction, and that is where you discover the answer to all the questions you always had. So this is an important point as well, because it shows that avidya is a relative thing, right? I'll come back to this in a second, but it's relative. It really depends on, there's many degrees of avidya is really the point here. And then the last one, this is the most challenging one of all, and this is where it says that in brief, avidya is what is called the five khandhas, the five upadana khandhas, sometimes translated as the five aggregates subject to clinging or grasping. Aggregates, I don't know if I really like the word aggregate so much, but these are like the five like constituents, in a sense, of what it means to be a human being, or five aspects of existence, if you like, five aspects of being human. There are five different aspects of what it means to be a being. And so in brief, this is suffering, right? And this is very challenging, because what that means, basically, is that existence itself, from a Buddhist point of view, is a problem. As long as you exist, you will suffer. Suffering and existence are inextricably linked to each other. You cannot pull them apart. They're part and parcel of the same thing. This is what he's saying here. And for this reason, one of the biggest problems that arises from this, because we can't see that clearly, and this is where I was talking about before, it comes down to insight, right? It's very hard to understand this. How can you understand that existence is inherently suffering? Very difficult to understand. And this is why I was saying before, it has to do with insight. Full understanding of suffering only comes from seeing things clearly. So this is why we crave for existence, right? This is why we want to move on. This is why we always we want to exist in this world, precisely because of that, because we think we cannot see these things actually for the way they are. So craving for existence is one of those very basic things in the human psyche, right? Or animal psyche, for that matter, right? Animals don't like to be killed either. Nobody likes to die. It's a very basic thing in the human psyche, this idea that we want to exist. So all of this is what we don't understand, right? All of these things have to do with avidya. So, and it's all of this that we have to look at in a different way. And as we do that, we are gradually emerging from delusion and moving towards seeing things more clearly. And it's some of these things are very simple, right? Like a death contemplation, not very hard at all. It's actually quite simple to do, but that already is enough to help us emerge from the delusion that we normally have. Powerful, powerful things. Just briefly, the first noble truth, I think, is by far the most important one. We have the second noble truth, the third noble truth, and the fourth noble truth. So the second noble truth is, as I was saying yesterday, the idea that craving is the source of suffering, and that can be, as I said, can be expanded, right? Of course, if we don't understand the source of suffering, it's very hard to do anything about it, so it's fairly obvious that we have to have some understanding of that, but it can be expanded. It can be expanded to show that dependent arising itself is basically an expression of the second noble truth. Avidya leads to suffering. Right? So what the Buddha is saying here is that because the second noble truth can be expressed in terms of dependent origination, If we don't understand dependent origination, right? Ignorance here is not understanding these things. So if we don't understand the dependent origination, we will be trapped by it. So it traps us because we don't understand it. It's an interesting little point. So it's really, and this is one of the reasons why it is interesting, of course, to look at this particular teaching, because once you start to understand it, to unravel it, you are moving away from that lack of understanding, that particular delusion, which concerns the second noble truth. You're moving away from that, and you're getting clarity about this. So by understanding dependent origination, you are stopping the process from working itself. Right? So that's kind of interesting. And it's one of the, of course, insights you have when you become a stream enterer, you become an Arya, a noble person, is precisely the insight into dependent origination. And then the third noble truth is again the same thing. If you abandon the craving, right? You abandon the suffering, because this can be expressed also by the cessation mode of dependent arising. Again, it's about understanding dependent arising in the cessation mode, and then you understand that one as well. And the fourth noble truth is a noble truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. And again, if you understand the path, of course, there is a hope of ending suffering. If you have no idea of the path, then you're not going to have any success. So it's fairly obvious why that also is an important part of this idea of avijja. So that's the four noble truths. The first one is by far the most important one. And just to summarize the first one, what it really means is that we think that there is happiness where there actually is suffering. We think there is suffering where actually maybe there is happiness. We have a distorted outlook about happiness and suffering in the world. And this, of course, is very important, because if you have a distorted outlook about happiness and suffering, you will pursue the wrong things. You will pursue things that lead to suffering, and you will not pursue those things that lead to true happiness. Of course, it's a bit of a mixture, right? It's not as if you're always pursuing suffering and always happiness, but as a general principle, that is true. So this is very important, because that gives us a foundation for understanding how the rest of this actually works. Another aspect, another aspect of this, and remember that very often in Buddhism, when we talk about suffering, we're talking about what is called the tilakkhana, the three characteristics of existence. And suffering is only one of those, but it always comes with the two other lakkhana. Lakkhana is like a characteristic. And the two other lakkhanas is the lakkhana of impermanence, of anicca. Things are always changing. Right? And from that comes the idea of suffering. Because things are always changing, but we don't want them to change, suffering arises as a consequence. But the third lakkhana is the lakkhana of non-self. Right? So there is no, from the Buddhist point of view, there is no substantial, nothing of substance in this life, nothing which always remains the same, nothing you can take to be yourself, basically. And this is a very important point here in terms of avijja. And the reason it is so important, because the sense of self that we have inside of us is ultimately a false sense. It is something which doesn't correspond to any reality. And it's a very deep-seated thing. Sometimes you will hear that modern psychologists, they will say that, oh yeah, Buddhism has got it right, because when you look into a psyche of a human being, you cannot see anything permanent in there. There's nothing substantial in there. There's no essence in there. But even that, or a philosopher might say the same thing, right? Saying, well, actually, yes, this seems to be right. There is nothing permanent or substantial to be found in the human body or mind. But this is only a superficial view. You know, sometimes people ask, well, what's the difference if a psychologist says there is no self and Buddhism says there is it the same thing? No, it's not the same thing, because that is only a superficial view which doesn't really have any profound effect on your own understanding of the world. Your own perception of yourself is still the same. You still feel the same way about yourself. You still have a deep-seated perception inside of you that actually there is something essential to you. Sometimes you don't even know it, right? You think that I can see that there's no self in here. But because it is so deep-seated, you're not actually able to see that you are basing yourself on this profound sense that you exist in a certain way. So the Buddhist idea, the only way you can get out of from the idea of non-self, or approach the idea of non-self and remove yourself from the sense of of existing in some way, again, is through insight, not through intellectual understanding, not through experimenting. That may help you to move in the right direction, but it's not itself, it's the same as having the profound insight. The profound insight is a revolution in your psychology. It's a revolution in your outlook, your understanding of yourself. That is what the profound insight is all about. Suddenly one day you realize everything is upside down, right? Everything is completely different from what you thought it was. You had everything completely wrong. And it's like you're waking up from this dream almost, and then you see reality in a completely different way. So this is important to understand. This is something profound, not something superficial at all. And then the second point here is what is this sense of self? What are some of the characteristics of it? And one of the most important characteristics of the sense of self is that we feel in charge of things. We feel that we are the doer. We feel that we are the person who creates, who does things, who is in charge of our own body and mind, who can go out into the world and control whatever it is that we want to control. This is one of the delusions, and we find this in places like the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which is precisely about the Anatta Lakkhana, the characteristics of non-self. The Buddha says in there that, because there is no self, you are not in charge of these 5 khandhas, these 5 personality groups I was talking about before. Your feelings, your perceptions, your consciousness, your body, or even your will. Right? Even your will, you're not in charge of your will. It sounds weird, doesn't it? But you're not in charge of your will. The will is something that arises because of cause and conditions. So, this is a very important aspect of the idea of self or non-self. Because we have this perception of self, we feel that we are in charge. But from a Buddhist point of view, there is nobody actually in charge. There's nobody who is the ultimate controller, the ultimate doer, the ultimate thing which actually controls things, especially within yourself, but even outside of yourself sometimes as well. And this is very important in the context of dependent arising, because if you feel that you can do things, if you feel that you can control yourself at the very least, then you will do that, right? That delusion would lead you onwards to start trying to control, trying to exercise your this freedom that you feel inside of yourself. So these two things together then become a very potent force, a very problematic force. This sense that you know where happiness is, right? I know where happiness is. And the second thing, that it is in your power to do something about it. Those two things combined, they become very powerful. I know what happiness is, and it's in my power to do something about it. It's obvious what you're going to do. The next thing is that you're going to go out there and try to control things, right? And try to make happiness for yourself. If you know where it is, and it's in your power, that is a consequence of that. So this shows you, this to me is perhaps the crux of this idea of ignorance or avijja, is those two factors coming together, and they then become the source, become the cause for the second factor, which is sankhara, those two together. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to you, because that is this is kind of one of the crucial points, I think, to understand how this process works. But before I go on to the second factor of this dependent arising, I want to have a look at another aspect as well, which I think is very, very useful just to have a very brief look at. And this is one of the ways that ignorance is often, or vijja or avijja, is taught in the gradual training. The gradual training is the gradual path from the very beginning all the way to awakening itself. And in that gradual training, vijja, understanding, is taught. There's 3 things that is taught as right understanding there, or awakening. And one is the recollection of past lives. One is the understanding of the law of karma. And the third one is the destruction of what we call the defilements, the asavas. And the destruction of the defilements is roughly equivalent to understanding the 4 noble truths. That's what I've been talking about now. But I haven't really fully talked about the recollection of past lives, right? But this is one of the vijjas, one of the understandings, right? One of the insights, if you like. If you want to talk about insight, We talk about vipassana a lot, but if you want to talk about real insight, this is real insight. Understanding, seeing your past lives. And this is very important because this ties in with what I was just talking about before, about the idea of what suffering is all about. If you recall your past lives, suddenly you get a very different perspective on existence. I'll tell you an interesting story later on. I thought I was going to talk about this morning, but it doesn't look like it. But there's a nice story which I like to tell because it shows you how this actually works. But if you remember your past lives, and the Buddha says, he says that when you do remember your past lives, right? We're talking about the real insights here. So this is very important on the Buddhist path. When you do, it's like you're turning on the lights, right? It says darkness is dispelled and light arises, right? And suddenly you can see. Suddenly you're not in the dark anymore. You've been in the dark all this time. Even if you have confidence that there is such a thing as rebirth, confidence is nothing. Seeing it is the real thing, right? Wow, this is what it's like. Life is very different from what I thought. And another metaphor that he uses, which I think is also very powerful, he says it's like a chick, a small little chick in an egg, right? This chick, just all they can see is the kind of eggshell around it. That's all they can possibly ever see. And then one day it starts with its claws and its beak to get out, to hack through the eggshell, and suddenly the world opens up. Right? The difference between being inside an egg and coming out into the world is obviously massive. It's an incredible difference. You are enclosed in this tiny little space. And as far as you know, before you hatch, maybe this is all there's to it, right? And then one day you hatch and you think, whoa, this is what it's like. Wow, the world is just so different from what I thought it was. And this is exactly what happens when you recall your past lives. Suddenly you understand things in a very, very different way. And for this reason, this is why this idea of recalling your past lives, gives you such an insight into suffering, because you can see how this thing just keeps on going, how it revolves around and around and around, right? And there is potentially no end to this whatsoever. So it ties in with the noble truth of suffering. What you're seeing here really is actually seeing that you have a direct insight into suffering itself. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Buddha, he had those insights before his own awakening experience. And then you have the idea of karma. The idea of laws of karma is just this impersonal law which drives you on from life to life. And it shows you that you are not really in charge of this, right? It is just driven by this impersonal law. Sometimes you get reborn in a nice place, sometimes it's not such a nice place. And it's kind of slightly random, right? There's this simile of the stick in the suttas. You throw up a stick, sometimes it goes on one end, sometimes it goes on the other end. And if you do a lot of good karma, it goes on one end. But sometimes you don't make a lot of good karma because you fall in the wrong company, right? You get reborn in an ISIS family and in the Middle East somewhere, right? And they say you must go out and be a fighter and fight everybody. And because you're a child, you think, okay, that's what my parents said, that's what I must do. This is how conditioned we are, right? We think that, okay, these ISIS fighters, they are real. Sometimes we think they're really bad people. But if you were in the same situation, if I was in the same situation, I'd probably do the same thing, right? Because we are conditioned into these things. So this is the thing, once you start to see that conditionality, you see the connection between karma and rebirth, again, it leads to a sense of understanding the big picture of dukkha. And then you have the Four Noble Truths at the end, which is the awakening experience itself. So just to make the point that this idea of rebirth is so fundamental and so important in the Buddhist teachings. And sometimes, I don't know, I've sometimes had debates with people who didn't believe in rebirth. And it's of course fine not to believe in rebirth, no problem with that. The problem is when you try to bring it into Buddhism and say that there is no rebirth. That's when it becomes problematic. But and sometimes you have a debate with people, and the debates I've had sometimes, the people don't. They want to kind of turn the debate aside. They want to debate other issues. They're fed up with talking about rebirth. But for me, when I was in these debates, I felt we need to discuss the idea of rebirth fully, because the entire teaching of Buddhism is colored by some very basic things. And one of those basic things is the idea of rebirth itself. If you go on to discuss other things without sorting out the basics, it is pointless. Because the basic things have to be, you have to be clear about the basics first of all. Otherwise, the other things don't really make any sense. They only make sense in the context of those basic points that the Buddha made. So this is why, to me, this is a fundamental aspect of the Buddha's teachings. But now what I want to do now is I want to just talk very briefly about how ignorance is itself conditioned. I was saying yesterday that there is no first cause for this ignorance or this delusion. It doesn't really, there is no first point. And the Buddha himself says in the sutta that if you look into the past, no first point of ignorance can be discerned. It just goes on back and back and back. And in another place he says that no first point of beings transmigrating and going on in samsara can be discerned. Beings hindered by ignorance, fettered by craving, no first point can be discerned. And so this idea of avijja, ignorance, and the idea of beings going on in samsara is basically two sides of the same thing. Because as long as there are beings there, ignorance will be there. Ignorance can only exist as an aspect of beings, right? So these two things revolve around each other. Now, I find this statement is quite fascinating, this idea that no first point can be discerned of beings hindered by ignorance, right? You are blind, you can't see. Ignorance hinders you. Nice idea. Fettered by craving. Craving is what binds you to the round. Craving is what drives you into a new rebirth. It projects you into the future all the time. No first point can be discerned. If you look into the past, the Buddha doesn't say, first of all, the idea that no first point can be discerned is interesting. It contrasts very sharply with almost all other philosophies and ideas of how the world is. Most religions, one of the main purposes of most religions is to postulate the first point, right? God created the universe. That is the first point. But for me, it's not really satisfactory. Okay, God created the universe, but what about God himself? Where did he come from? It doesn't really explain anything, right? It doesn't explain the beginning at all. It just shifts the idea. You might as well say that the universe has always been there. It doesn't really make much difference. Or from a scientific point of view, again, they say it all began with the Big Bang. But where did that come from? It all came out of nothing, or what? It's kind of, again, it's not really explained properly. The first point hasn't really been pointed out. And I think there was some scientist who said once that he was kind of making some quip about something, that, well, just give me one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. Right? The one free miracle is the Big Bang. And then once we have that free miracle, then everything else kind of works out nicely. But in Buddhism, there is no need for any free miracle, right? Free or non-free or whatever it is, not really required. Because the Buddha says, no first point can be discerned. It just keeps on going on back and back and back. There's always another cause prior to that last event that you have seen. There's always going back further. And to me, that makes Buddhism such a realistic teaching, right? It is so this is actually the way the world obviously works. There's always another cause prior to the cause that you can see, or the result that you can see. So this is the first thing which is so nice about this particular thing. And this includes ignorance, right? Avijja, just going back and back and back. And the second nice thing about this, that the Buddha says, is that he says there's no discoverable beginning. The Buddha doesn't make some kind of statement, we're talking about philosophy very briefly yesterday. The Buddha doesn't make some kind of philosophical statement to say it goes on forever, right? He doesn't say that. He says there is no discernible beginning. In other words, he says that, well, as far as I've gone into the past, I can't see any beginning. And that's really all I can say. So he deals with empirical facts. This is what can be known, this is what can be seen. He doesn't deal with metaphysical speculation, with the idea that I'm going to speculate about things. He only talks about what can actually be discovered and seen. So again, it is kind of very realistic, right? And this is one of those beautiful things to me about the Buddha's teaching. It is based on reality, based on on insight and understanding, and not based on speculation. It's based on what we can know through the senses and through inferences drawn from that. So this is, so there's no first point to ignorance then, right? Or no first point can be discovered. That's what he's saying here. So what does that mean? Does that mean that there is nothing that has an influence on our vidya, nothing that has an influence on our delusion? No, it doesn't mean that. There are things that actually affect delusion, and this is why there's something we can do about it. And what the Buddha says is that the thing which affects delusion is the 5 hindrances. And this is one of the suttas that I also is in here somewhere. So what the things that actually affect delusion, avidya, is the 5 hindrances. Now I'm moving outside of dependent origination, right? Dependent origination starts with avidya. Now I'm moving slightly outside, and maybe I'll talk more about this later on, but I think it's important just to get the whole picture at the beginning here. So the 5 hindrances are what affect delusion. But because we are outside of dependent arising, it is a different type of conditionality which works here. I was talking yesterday again about conditionality, which is necessary and sufficient conditionality, but that is not what we're seeing here. It's a different kind of conditionality, and the conditionality which works here is a conditionality of nutriment or food. So the 5 hindrances, they are a nutriment for delusion. So in other words, it feeds delusion, right? So the more you have of these hindrances, the worse delusion gets. If you take away the 5 hindrances completely, there's no support anymore. There's no nutriment for delusion. And this begins to show us the solution to the problem, how the problem can actually be resolved. So, take away the 5 hindrances, there is no support for delusion anymore. It means that when the 5 hindrances are gone, this should be our job, right? To get rid of those 5 hindrances. And then there is a possibility. Delusion becomes weak. It doesn't have a foundation anymore. And at that point, it becomes possible to undo the delusion and make it into understanding itself. So this is the point here. This is the first point. This shows us, it begins to show us the path, how to get rid of these things. And of course, I hope maybe I'm talking too quickly here. The 5 hindrances, I presume that you know what those are. If you don't, please write down a question. I can talk about those this evening or something. So this is the first point here. The 5 hindrances are the support of delusion. Now, what that also means is that the stronger those hindrances are, the more delusion there is, right? If you reduce the hindrances, you start to see things more clearly. You start to see the world more clearly. So, or even in ordinary life, if you have less ill will, right? Less desires, if you have less restlessness, if you have less of these things, you actually have less delusion. And it feeds in, you're starting to understand more about happiness and suffering as a consequence of that. So delusion is reduced, right? So delusion is not a static thing. It may always have been there, but it's not static. It kind of ebbs and flows. Just like the ocean, right? It ebbs and flows, and then it becomes very powerful sometimes when you are in the grip of defilements, and it becomes very weak sometimes when you feel really peaceful and really relaxed. And this then feeds into the whole mechanism. It feeds into the mechanism of dependent arising. And the more hindrances you have, the more suffering you have as a consequence. Because this whole thing, works its way through those 12 factors of dependent arising.